Okay. So, hello, this is Jahan McDonald, founding steward of the Rootwater Project, and welcoming you all in today. I'm going to be in conversation with Ashley Rogers, who is executive director of the Whitney Plantation Museum. And we're going to be talking about sort of institutional social justice work. We'll be talking a bit about the ritual that the Whitney is going to be hosting with us in September, and also just staying open to where the conversation goes. So, for folks who don't know, the Rootwater Project supports descendants of enslaved Africans in alchemizing intergenerational grief and trauma into healing through storytelling, education, and ritual. And so, to be in good practice, the way that we like to start this time, you can't quite see it, can see. Uh, I got my plant here. You can see the little leaf, it's off screen. But to start with libations and just take a moment to ground and get present together. So I start with just welcoming in any ancestors who are healthy and well in their process and who are aligned with the purpose of the work that we're doing. We welcome you to be present with us and contribute your voices through us. We can say Ashe is a welcome way of welcoming them in. And the first question to people who join us is always, well, I'm like sort of getting a little bit ahead of myself. So I'll kind of actually loop back to giving you a moment to talking more about just who you are and how you come to this work. But starting with just naming and sharing an ancestor who has inspired you to do the work that you do.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think that for me, uh, it's the person who inspires me um, is an ancestor, is past, but is not my ancestor. It's actually um, a dear friend of mine who was always a mentor to me. Cinnamon Catlin Legutko, who did a lot of work in the museum space. She she had a museum that she worked on decolonizing, and she was really um, brave and strong and unapologetic and fought really hard for justice in museums. And she was doing incredible work and gone too soon. But she's someone who I always looked up to and I still think about quite a bit.
Thank you. And that was Cinnamon
Catlin Legutko.
Catlin the Gut Club.
Yeah.
So say Ashe, thank you for your work and your practice. And to like make a quick note too, I think that what you brought up is like really important when we talk about doing this work that, ancestors, of course, has to do with our personal lineages and bloodlines.
Mhm.
But once people pass over, like they're everybody's. And that, it's not, there's nothing proprietary about that.
Yeah.
So all of those folks who are just, yeah, aligned in spirit are welcome and part of the conversation. Um, and so to just close out this particular process, I'll also name that I think about my grandmother, Cora Brown, um, often in this work. And she was somebody who was born sort of in the period, like early Jim Crow is like right post enslavement, early Jim Crow, and who I think about in terms of being like a very rooted activist. And so it's like not somebody who was like going out making big speeches, but just in the ways that she lived her life and the things that she spent her time and attention on, and some of the risks that she was willing to make, and that like participating in the NAACP when that was still considered a terrorist organization
Mhm.
by the government. And, that she being one of those people who, like the droplets that make up the ocean, that moves the whole tide and that don't often get named in particular. Um,
Hmm.
but the work can't get done without them.
Yeah.
So for people like her and all these others we know, but we may not know their exact names, but we know the impacts that they've had in our lives through their presence in the world. We'll just close the thing three ashes. Ashe, ashe, ashe. So yeah, with that, wanting to drop in and just hear a little bit more about who you are and the work that you do.
Yeah. So I'm Ashley. I've been here for 12 years at Whitney Plantation. So I'm the founding director. I was the first director of the museum. I was hired by the museum's founder, um, John Cummings, who purchased the property in 1999 and worked on creating the museum over 15 years. And it was me and our research director, Dr. Ibrahim Asek, who were the first employees of the museum. So, so I've built it, built up the kind of the staffing and the interpretation and kind of all of the programming here over the past decade plus, and have seen it through a lot of, major phases of growth, and kind of had to think about how to build a real structure here from something that was founded, you know, by just one person, and kind of taking that vision and turning it into something that could be successful. So that's basically, and my uh, background is that I'm a museum administrator, so I kind of handle uh, all the administrative aspects of the museum. But I'm trained as a historian. My PhD is in history, and um, and so I also um, do a certain amount of research on my own, and also am the person who's kind of responsible for sort of distilling some of the interpretive design and interpretive ideas. So basically taking the ideas that Dr. Sek has, established as the research director, and then translating that to something that anyone, even with no background in history, could learn about and then disseminate to the public.
Mhm. And that's such an important part of what to me is so special about the Whitney is that when we talk about like the place of plantation museums in the larger cultural ecosystem, most of them function as these kind of like weird gone with the wind type of like, oh, like here's a look at the kitchen and like all the different foods that they used to make, or like here's all the different little fashions, or let's talk
Mm.
about the architecture and the columns. And the distinction of the Whitney being that it talks about the people
Hmm.
and it talks about what life was like for all the vast complexity of what that
Hmm.
means. Um, and so I would love to hear a little bit more about like what it means to you to be telling the story and to be shaping the narrative in that way. And also a little bit about like how that sort of in a way, I think changes what a museum even really is
Hmm.
for the way that a lot of people think about museums is like, well, that stuff is like all about the past, but that there's a way that telling the story this way really does bring it into the present. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, when I was working on the mission statement, um, with the board. We have a very memorable mission statement. It's short and sweet. We'll never forget what it is, but we educate the public about the history and legacies of slavery in the United States. And having the word legacies in the mission statement was extremely important to me because, you know, we have one central goal here, which is that we have a plantation site, which was, operational for over 200 years. So we need to educate people about what this place is and kind of what it is in context and who are the people who lived here. But everybody who comes to us, and we have like, roughly 100,000 visitors a year, they're not coming necessarily with knowledge about the past. They're coming with knowledge about the present. And what they want to see, what people find meaningful about learning about history, is how it connects to their present day. And we know that there are strong, lasting legacies of slavery in this country, that Black people in the United States have been free for far less time than they were enslaved. And so there is no way that a modern day society can exist without those ghosts, without those remnants of that system. And so talking about legacies is a way for us to bring this story up to the very present day for people and to help them understand the world they live in. I mean, even just in the last week, right? We see this Supreme Court ruling about the voting that's basically gutting what was left of the Voting Rights Act. That doesn't exist in a vacuum. You can't look at that kind of decision and not look at the antecedents and understand Jim Crow and understand the Civil War and understand slavery. So it's really a way for us to educate people about all of that. And, to think about, how different we are and what it means to me. One of the things is plantation museums sort of like run the gamut. There's all kinds of plantation museums, but a lot of them, I would say museum is a rather loose
Mm.
definition for what they are. They're not
I would
really,
agree with that.
you know what I mean? Um, for instance, at least here in Louisiana, I don't know what it's like in South Carolina, some of these other big areas where there's a lot of plantation tourism, right? A lot of these are for-profit businesses that are essentially, you know, they started as kind of roadside attractions. These were not institutions that were committed to education. They were there to entertain the traveling public, mostly Northerners who were coming down to the South to kind of see what did the South look like. And then they're putting on a show. It's this kind of elaborate masquerade, right? So, and even the ones that have begun to be more committed to real museum work, throughout the South, there is still that kind of history lurking in the background, right? Here, where we are, in the River Road context, we are one of the few plantations that is completely a nonprofit, that has an educational mission, and that employs PhD historians, right? Like,
Mhm.
this is about communicating real history, doing real research. And that is something that is a huge difference. I mean, fundamentally, you could look at a lot of different ways that we're different. Obviously, we tell the story of enslavement here. This is about the people who were enslaved. And that is, probably the number one way we differ. But so much of that is rooted in our rigorous research and academic process. I don't know how you could have a rigorous historical process and not come to the conclusion that slavery is the point of a plantation, right? So,
No arguments from me there. Yeah. I mean, and it's really wild. And I think that it's hard for a lot of people to really digest just how much effort intentionally, like it's not on accident, has been intentionally put into having people not understand what you just said.
right.
And
Yes.
that seems extreme or radical or like, but why would anybody do that? And it's
Yeah.
like, it's that's literally the record that was left. At the time people were doing it,
Yeah.
they were not ashamed of what they were doing.
No.
They were not trying to hide it in any way. It's all right there.
No, these are pillars of society, right? I mean, this is the thing. The people who owned these plantations were respected,
Yeah.
like very well respected people in society. Everything they were doing was perfectly legal. This is the other thing. Like, this was
And
not just
celebrated. Not
legal,
just
it was
legal, but celebrated and encouraged.
condoned and encouraged. And the thing that I always say to people too is like, it is true that, the slave owning was a practice by a lot of quite wealthy people, also everyday people. There were plenty of people who were enslavers who only owned one or two people, right? But even if you think about like all of the people who didn't own enslaved people in the US South, the way that I talk about this with people is like enslavement was aspirational, right? If
Mhm.
they didn't own people, that's not necessarily because of principle. It's maybe because of lack of access, because they didn't have the money, but they sure wanted to, right? Because that was the way that you advanced in society at that time. So that is a conversation that I think a lot of people who run plantations are kind of not ready to have. It's difficult to have those types of conversations, honestly. I was just told by a colleague that they went to a neighboring plantation this last weekend, um, who, when the subject of our plantation came up on the tour, they said something that I've heard a million times. Oh, nothing they're saying is true. They're lying about everything, right? This is
Oh,
what this
wow.
is what's said about us. because because people are so uncomfortable with the truth, right? Because the truth, what we talk about here forces people to confront something, not just about themselves as an individual, but it forces them to confront something about their a bigger identity, an identity as a Southerner, an identity as an American. You
Mhm.
know, you have to wrestle with really uncomfortable things if you honestly acknowledge that this country was built on the backs of enslaved people. And like, what does that really mean? Play it out. What does it really mean? You know? The only answer I think for a lot of people is they must be lying, right? It couldn't have been that bad. They can't confront it.
Yeah, I mean, and that is so much of why, and I think it's easy to create binaries of like who has difficulty with that. And honestly, a lot of Black folks have difficulty with that too. Like you would think that that would be a real simple equation, but when you get into the emotions of it and you get into the human psychology encountering this information, it changes things completely, and you have some people who are like, well, yeah, but like, it wasn't that bad. Or, oh, yeah, but that was so long ago. Or like there's always some kind of or like redirection from it because the pain really of having to reconcile that information and not just the information, but it forces you as a person to make a choice
Hmm.
about who you are in relation to it. And
Yeah.
that is not passive. And it's so a lot of like where I started my work as a space holder and facilitator and like ritualist really had to do with developing processes for people to be able to sit in that discomfort,
Hmm.
have that integration experience, but do it in a way that is supported. That it's like, it's not just you out there alone, and you're not the only person dealing with this. And what we know from like both psychology and just like larger general human culture wisdom is that like it takes a community. It's not work that you can do on your own. And that's such a big part of the call for people. It's like, come, let us gather, let's talk about it, let's tell the truth about it,
Hmm.
but let's do that together and not in our own little silos of that. Um, there's like a quick anecdotal story that I want to share, which for me really emphasized the importance of that kind of work. And so my family, at least on my father's side, comes from Alabama. And well, that's first generation. He comes from Alabama. We come from everywhere, all over, all over the South. But we had gone back. It was me, my brother, and my dad on this particular trip. And we went to an area in northern Alabama where a lot of my family is from and is still rooted. And we went to this small town with some family that lives down there. and there is a town, there's like a square. It's this very kind of traditional setup. And around the edge of the square are these little stands. Now, the historical markers on those stands say that it was for hitching horses, that you would
Hmm.
get up on there and it made it easier for you to hop on your horse.
Hmm.
Now, the oral history that my family knows from having been there for generations is that that is where they used to put enslaved people for market. That information is not on those signs. And so the 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 dissonance of that storytelling, and we got, into it with ourselves of like, well, who approved these signs?
Hmm.
Why did they approve these signs? What is the purpose of these signs telling this story? And it could even be a yes and that both of those things happened.
Hmm.
But the fact that this part of the history is intentionally left out, and also that there is such a devaluation of oral history,
Hmm.
and that there's so much information that's kept out of the institutional record
Hmm.
for like intentionally. And that to me was just a really impactful thing of like, even when you go and try to do the research and like try to go to yourself and find the places, that even then you can't totally always trust the story, and you
Hmm.
really just have to always question it and bring your own grounded knowing of
Hmm.
America to the situation. Um, yeah, it still trips me out to this day. But
Yeah.
that,
I mean, well, and there's so much like that. I mean, I remember I'm from North Carolina. There's a town that I used to go visit because we had a family friend who lived there. And the town square, uh, right, like it was, kind of like a public park situation, and they had outdoor water fountains there, and there were two of them. And they were, just flanking, and they look like they're kind of put there to, be symmetrical and be flanking, except that we're told by our family friend that those were segregated water fountains. And all they did was just take down the signs, but they're still there. You know what I mean? It's like we're left with all of this, and this is kind of what I mean about the legacies. It's like it's everywhere. It's not only like systemically in our prison system, in how our cities are laid out, in our education system, but there are physical scars on the landscape of slavery and segregation that we are still, you walk around and you walk in the French Quarter today. I live in New Orleans. The French Quarter is full of slave quarters, you know
absolutely.
and they're everywhere, and we like literally live in these spaces, and yet have not really reckoned with what all of it means.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a question that I was part of like a Black arts collective. It's actually one of the first ways that I ended up in New Orleans, was doing some work on a project called Dignity in Process. Um, but the collective that I met that person through, we were participated in an exhibit here in the Bay Area that was all around this question of how does transatlantic slave trade impact your life every day?
Hmm.
And just one example of that, which I want to like get tie into this question of like how how this shows up in practical ways. Because what I also often find is that when we bring this up, people just get so overwhelmed, right?
Mhm.
And even if they do know, they're like, but what do I do? How do I actually change the way that I live or the way that I do things to respond to this? Um, and one of the things that I think about often is like our entire labor system is built off of the premise of enslaving labor. And the idea that the best way for a system to work is to figure out how you can pay people the least and
Hmm.
get the most from them, right?
Hmm.
And that's a worldview strategy that accomplishes that, is how I see that. Like that's a cultural principle that's at work.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I've appreciated also in just like being in conversation with you and the museum as a whole is that there are some structural ways that you all are responding to that in terms of how you deal with people, how you deal with employment, how you deal with reciprocity for what people bring to the museum. And I would love to hear more about how that works for y'all.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways that I think that it's really important that we live out our mission in lots of different ways, and that we keep in mind, you know, the lessons of the history that we're teaching as we practice this place as an organization, as a place of employment. So, several things that we've thought about. We so first of all, with our gift shop, this seems like a pretty silly thing if you don't think about it, but we're extremely intentional about a gift shop. It's a major way that we raise funds for the organization, right? So we need to have this. But I've seen in a lot of museum spaces that there can be a real disconnect in how gift shops are run. They're oftentimes run by separate organizations, so they like parcel it out. So I'll give an example. I was at a museum that was a human rights museum. And in that museum, they had exhibits talking about the atrocious human rights records of textile companies who print t-shirts. And then in the gift shop, they had t-shirts for the Human Rights Museum printed on the t-shirts that they had called out in the gallery. So this is more common than you would imagine, actually. So,
I'm pretty cynical, so I,
yeah. So
yeah.
this is the kind of thing that like, we try to be really intentional about. So we had like we have a whole like schema for how we do our gift shop buying. We do not buy things that are made outside of the US unless they're certified fair trade. And we focus on Black-owned businesses here locally. So, highlighting Black makers. This one has been like, this is an odd one, but a few years ago we did this. We no longer sell chocolate in the gift shop unless it is fair trade also and from really South America. The reason for that, and I love a chocolate bar as much as the next person, but the fact of the matter is, if you are eating chocolate that's made by like a major chocolate company, any General Chocolate, the chances are pretty high that it touches child slavery in Africa. There are enslaved children in Africa today who are heavily involved in the cacao industry. It's not the case with South American chocolate. So, anyways, this is a thing that we have to think about, and for instance, we don't make as much money in the summertime as we used to because we used to sell ice cream. We don't because of this, like, because of this commitment. Um, and and it doesn't mean that we all have to be like absolutely perfect in our individual lives, but we put up signs about this too because we want to use this everything we do as a way to educate our audience, that like there's a reason why we do things this way so that we can highlight these stories for you and you can kind of understand, right? In terms of like so we're a nonprofit, as I mentioned, we have a board of directors, which is uh, majority Black, majority women. Two of the women on our board are descendants of the museum. It wasn't a museum, descendants of the plantation. Their ancestors were enslaved here and worked here after slavery as well, because this plantation operated until 1975. So there's a really, really long history. Um, we also have descendants, who work on our staff kind of at all levels. We've had descendants on the staff. And part of that is a function of being in a rural place, and we hire people from this community. Many of the people from this community are descendants, but it's also something that we think about quite intentionally. A traditional way that a museum would approach staffing, uh, and what I've been told by a lot of my museum colleagues is like, hire history students. And history students are welcome here. I've hired many history students over the years. But it would be always my preference to hire someone from this community, someone who potentially is a descendant of this plantation, and to train them because anybody can learn history. This is not, you do not need a degree in this. There's nothing proprietary. And also, a lot of the people that we've hired, they have family stories that they can tell. Now, I will never force anyone to tell their family story here. That is not going to ever be a requirement. But I've always invited it if they want to. If there are things that they want to add to the tour that is about their own family's oral history, something that they feel comfortable sharing about their culture, where they come from, what they're, talking about like foodways in the kitchen. One of our tour guides, said, well, his grandmother used to make raccoon gumbo. I was like, that's, if you want to say that, you can say that, just as a way to kind of connect that we're talking about real people.
Mhm.
We also, we pay a bit like above market in for some of the lower positions. The thing that we unfortunately, the folks that are in kind of like director level roles are paid a little below market. The people in the lower roles pay a little bit above. Try to sort of meet in the middle as a way to try to like, try to get better equity on the team. But we also offer full benefits. I mean, this is something that's not really common here. They all have even if they're part-time, they all have 401k. They're 100% vested immediately. We pay for our health insurance, vision, dental, 100% of the premiums. So we try to, and we also have paid vacation, paid time off for everybody on staff, part-time, full-time. Um, and so there are things that we've thought about, even as we've got like HR consultants and stuff, and some of them have said like, some of these benefits are really generous. Like a lot of people wouldn't do this. And I'm like, well, this is the point, is that this was a site of stolen labor for 200 years. We don't have enough money to do everything I'd like to do. We don't have enough money to, but we do the best we can. And it means that like of all of our revenue that comes in, it's like 60 to 65% is just paying staff. That is what it costs to run this place. I could do that a lot cheaper if I wanted to, but it's important. It is a commitment that we've made to do better. And we also don't have unpaid internships. And apart from, we have a Juneteenth celebration, so we're kind of recruiting some volunteers for one day, but we don't operate with a volunteer staff. A lot of museums have like full-time unpaid work, and that's not something that we do here. So, just a lot of different ways that we've thought about that to try to make it so that we're living out what we say we're doing.
Wow. And I really appreciate that. I'm a person who's very much about like, it's about the how,
Hmm.
because the how is what we actually do. And I feel like a broken record often because people come to me like as a consultant and advisor, like one of my roles, I'm like on 85 million boards and
Yeah.
and three councils. And for me, that's about trying to normalize certain perspectives
Hmm.
from a leadership stance that is like, okay, if we're working on principles and we're working on values, right? That's a cultural design. The
Yeah.
the outputs that we have now are the products of a cultural design
Hmm.
that's built on selfishness, that's built on essentially in many ways things that are just evil, like
Hmm.
just evil human behavior. And if we're going to do something different and produce something different, we have to look at the how. We have
Hmm.
to look at the strategy, and that we cannot be using the same systems to do that. And I think a lot of people, they're like, well, if we just get enough money or if we just get enough power, and it's like, okay, I don't disagree with you. Money and power are important in a capitalist system. How do you get the money? How do you get the power?
Yeah.
If you're getting them through the same means that produced the results that we're living with now, we're not fixing it.
Hmm.
It's just we're just recreating it with a new face
Yeah.
or, new branding, but it's the same thing. And
Hmm.
that's such a big part of the way that the Rootwater Project is designed as well, is like, how are we doing this and doing the best that we can to make it like accessible to people, while also honoring the fact that particularly when it comes to like healing and cultural work, a lot of that is really done with a lot of generosity,
Hmm.
and really not wanting to do that in the same way. So being able to like honor people in ways that are, have reciprocity for what they bring, that we're paying people decently when they do, that we are starting with relationships first. Like so much of the project is really building relationships and just having conversations with people
Hmm.
about it and not just being like, well, here's some money I can give you to do this thing. That's it. We don't talk about anything else, you know? But yeah, really honoring people's whole humanity in that. Um, so we don't have too much time left. So I do want to, we've talked a lot about like sort of the past and like the things that lead up to this. And I know that there's like the Juneteenth celebration that's coming up, which is a really big one.
Hmm.
And I'm curious about like what else is happening with the museum right now that's exciting about the present and the future.
Yeah, so we are currently, I have a little task force, and we are working on, I think, the most interesting project I've ever done at this museum. So we have one of the things that sets Whitney apart, is that we are a site of memory. We have several memorials on our site that name and honor people who were enslaved, and one of them is called the Wall of Honor, and that is where all the tours start, and it has all of the people who were enslaved on this property. But that memorial was done a really long time ago. We have continued to do research over the years, and it even has just a few, just things that are wrong about it. There's like a couple typos and just things. The person who actually did the memorial, we weren't totally happy with how it was done. So there were some things we wanted to fix. So um, I applied for a grant and received it last year to completely redo that memorial. So what we've said for years is that that has the names of about 350 people. But I told my team, I was like, we need to start from scratch. We need to lay eyes on every single record. We need to figure out, what we're doing and how, build a huge database, right? We're up to 600 people.
Wow.
So that's,
Wow.
almost 300 more people whose names were not on that original memorial who are now going to be there. But the other thing that we're doing, and this is the work that I'm very proud of, is that when I was working on my dissertation, I started working on genealogies of people who were enslaved here. So I wrote about the period after slavery. So I was very interested in what happened to people, where did they go? And through doing a lot of that research, there was an inventory that was taken of this plantation in 1860. It has the names of 101 people who were enslaved here at that time. And I figured out that most of those people were blood relatives. And it really upended what I think, what a lot of people think about families and slavery. What we hear a lot is about families being separated, and that is definitely true also, but it kind of counteracted like the reality here, which is that I found just in doing that research, there were two women who were enslaved on this plantation who were enslaved alongside their grandchildren. They knew they had adult children who had kids, adult siblings. I mean, people, cousins, nieces, nephews, grand. I mean, it was all there. And so, as we've been doing this research, we've been uncovering more of these women who I call matriarchs. These are women who were enslaved at the same time as their grandkids saw their grandkids grow up. And we've identified now, I think, six of them. So we're going to be able to display on this wall not just disconnected names, but I really want to show families and to put people back in their family groups so that people, when they come, they can see a genealogy, not only to emphasize the importance of those family connections between enslaved people, but also for people who are descendants, they're really like aching to find evidence of their ancestors. But right now, it's disconnected names, there's no structure to it. So being able to go and see, like, this is a whole family tree, right? And these are my ancestors. In some cases, we know people's last names, or we know the last names that those families took on after slavery. So people could actually do that. So there's going to be two elements of this. One is this memorial, this rethought memorial, which we're going to also we're asking for descendants to advise us. Once we've got all our data together, we're putting together a descendant panel to talk about how it should be shown. And then we also are going to be building an online database so that people will be able to find their ancestors here. So I'm really excited about this. It is incredible, incredible work.
That's amazing. I'm like really, I'm just like kind of getting chills just thinking about the implications of all of that and also feeling the resonance. Because as I've shared with you, and your team in conversation of what inspired me
Hmm.
to not just do grief work in general, that's like a whole lifetime of realities, but that visiting the Whitney and seeing in particular the memorial that's dedicated to the children
Hmm. Yeah.
and seeing so many stories of
Hmm.
like things I've experienced,
Hmm.
things that I know through my oral history lineage that have been experienced by other people in my family.
Hmm.
And that playing such a fundamental part of the design of the ritual, in that we are asking people not to come alone. That
Hmm.
if you come, that you need to bring at least one other member of your family,
Hmm.
because this stuff doesn't impact us as individuals. It impacts us as whole systems of relationships and how those have been defined by this structure of enslavement.
Hmm.
And that means so many things. Like it means a lot of disconnection, for example, but it also means a lot of maybe unexpected connection
Yeah.
as well, like just in a kind of anecdotal way. Like among Black folks, there's like we kind of have a saying where it's like everybody went Natchez way, right? Because it was such which is referencing Natchez, Mississippi, that it was this point that so many people passed through,
Yeah.
even in the process of being connected, that itself became its own point of connection, that
Yeah.
people have passed through there. Um, but just, yeah, thinking about what it means for people to be able to do that research, because it's really hard.
Hmm.
My mother was the family genealogist and she's passed away now. And part of what I've inherited from her is just like boxes and boxes
It's
of
overwhelming.
research. It's so overwhelming.
And yeah, and this is why this project is taking us longer than we thought because, there's also language barriers. Some of the languages, some of the documents are in French, some of them are in Spanish. They're written
Mm.
in 1812. You can't read their handwriting. I mean, and then you're looking at hundreds of people. So like our brains are just, fried every time we have one of these meetings. But there's incredible stories, and the thing that I really love about it is like we already know that slavery is an inherently oppressive system, of course, and that these people are, living within this oppressive structure. But the records that we have show us choices that people made. So, like, for example, um, there were a lot of men who were sold. You talk about Natchez, right? But New Orleans is obviously another huge location. People get sold from the Upper South, right? There are a lot of men who get sold down here and they end up on a sugar plantation like this. They're disconnected from their whole family, right? But they form new families here. And a lot of the women on the plantation are Creole women. They're women who are French speaking, culturally, French, attend the Catholic Church, for instance. They baptize their children in the Catholic Church. And when these men come, one of the things we've seen is adult baptisms. So these are men who are coming from, let's say, Virginia, right? And they end up here and they've met a woman on the plantation and they want to be married to that woman and they want to have children with this woman. But if they want, she wants those kids to be baptized in the church. And the only way that's happening is if he gets baptized too. So we see these men getting baptized at the age of 30, right? And then we see all of these children of these women getting baptized in the church. That's there are choice. I mean, I understand that we're talking about like there's layers here, right? So the Catholic Church is definitely also an oppressive institution, but we're also talking about people who are existing within that and still making choices for their family as they can,
Yes.
right?
And that's so important because, again, it's like it, there's a lot of flattening that's
Hmm.
easy to take place in
Yeah.
the conversation. And there's a workshop we're going to be offering from the project about ancestral vision boarding as a way of like connecting with the fullness of these people. And it's just something I'm also noting. Like, I know this is a change I've made with myself of like, how we talk about people and not being like these people were slaves, right? That
Right.
is such a flattening statement to make
Mhm.
rather than saying like these were people who were enslaved, right?
Yeah.
That brings in context, that brings in conditions, that brings in choice, where it's like, well, if somebody was enslaved, that means somebody chose to enslave them. And that
Hmm.
person is not just a slaveholder or, something that's passive. That person is an enslaver.
Yeah.
They're
Right.
making an active choice to do what they're doing. And that it really is empowering to give people their full humanity back and recognize that, like, we all live within constrained choices. None
Mhm.
of us has what is absolute freedom. Even the people, the little 1% people, they have their own weirdo chains that they deal with that are very different than ours. But they are also not operating with just like total, complete, human liberation. Um, but that within that, each of us has choices and we
Hmm.
have options available to us about how we live based on the fact that that just is the way that it is.
Hmm.
And so I just really love and appreciate that invitation to like really look at people as not just the survivors of other people's choices.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
Yes.
I think like when we talk about, when we use words like resilience, it's such a trap. It's like, well, you have to be like, it doesn't. You know what I mean? And so I'm always looking for, like, we talk a lot about resistance, the ways that people resisted slavery. And sometimes that looks like armed rebellion. And sometimes that looks like claiming a piece of your own humanity and culture for yourself, like
Yes.
preserving your culture, preserving your language, preserving your family to the best of your ability. There's all kinds of ways. And so even though I know it's like within the church, I see that as part of it, right? Like legally, they couldn't get married. That was against the law in
Right.
Louisiana.
Right.
But they were getting married in the church. I mean, we have record of people who were enslaved who got married in the church right up the road in the Catholic Church in 1749. Like these are people who were born in Africa and they survived the Middle Passage and they ended up here and they're disconnected from their family. But they got married. Nobody's forcing that marriage. Again, it is illegal, right? So if they're doing that, it's because they've sought special permission in order to do that. And I think that it's just so important, and as you flash forward in time and think about the people who were here, all these families that I found in 1860, that the reason I was able to figure out who they are is because they stay together after the war, through incredible odds. These are people who sometimes the men went off and fought for the Union Army and they're gone for 3 years, but they come back to their community, to their partner, and continue their families for a very long time, right? And so I think that all of that is so important. And so there's you have to talk about violence, you have to talk about like the structure of oppression, but it is so important to talk about how people refused to comply with that, and demanded a
Yes.
piece of their own humanity.
Yeah, there's like it's kind of starting to go around, at least in my circles, and I have to recognize I exist in uncommon circles. But is that the, that it's like the idea that right now resistance, and it really has always been this way in a way, is like it's often just being ungovernable.
Right?
It's
Yeah.
having the willingness to not just do the thing because, quote unquote, that's your job or
Mhm.
because somebody told you to. It's really the development of enough of your own personal willpower to do the thing that you know is right or to do the thing that does not compromise your soul and to even
Mhm.
value your soul enough to take
Yeah.
that on.
Yeah.
And it like there's so much more I can say about that.
One of my favorite, there's a lot of ways that like we learn about resistance and ways that enslaved people resisted, but one of my very favorite ways that is documented over and over and over again is enslaved people pretending like they don't understand instructions.
Yeah.
So so that the enslavers have to say it over and over again. They get increasingly frustrated with it, and they just
Mhm.
act like, I don't, what are you talking about? And they do it wrong on purpose.
Weaponized incompetence.
Yeah.
I know about it thanks to patriarchy, but I'll say one of mine that I've taken on, and I have to like give myself my own like hipster cred of being like, this was well before the nap ministry. Like shout outs to it. I deeply respect it and celebrate the work, but I was doing it first on my own. Which is just resting,
Hmm.
taking naps. Because when I would think about what I knew from the place of what I consider like immense privilege of having people telling me the stories, both personally and coming through books, so the personal lineage of the people in my family, of parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, all of that, but also the collective storytellers like Alice Walker and Toni Morrison and Toni Cade Bambara and like all of these people who are doing that storytelling work as well. And when I, as a young person, was just trying to, feel out for me, because that question of like, well, what is freedom even really about has been a core organizing question. Because I was just so steeped in that as like, this is the question that my existence rests upon, was other people's audacity to dream that this concept of freedom was a real thing and
Hmm.
that it was worth pursuing against just really literally unbelievable odds. And I don't use that word lightly. Like I'm a words person. So when I'm like unbelievable, a lot of times it gets used and it's like, no, that's totally believable. Like what's happening with the government right now, not unbelievable at all. There's
Right.
precedent for all of that. But the conditions of chattel enslavement, there actually was no precedent for that.
Hmm.
It was an unbelievable and torturous system.
Hmm.
And so the fact that I exist at all, and with the amount of relative ease and, all of those things that goes with that, and like, well, what is mine to do with that?
Hmm.
And getting to like the story that I was told a lot is like, well, I just got to keep working, right? Like we just keep working all the time. And I was like, that doesn't feel right. I don't
Hmm.
think that that's what the people were like surviving for, was so that I could continue to work my whole life and never experience rest or play or like all of these other things that are the total balance of a human life, which of
Hmm.
course includes work. That's life is work. That's like part of the physics of material world, is that it takes work. But yeah, that one, and I think that also being important just in kind of this larger narrative sense, because I was called lazy all the time and people just like, well, what do you mean you're just going to take a nap? And that for me was resistance. That I was like, yeah, I'm gonna take a nap because the sun is good. And this is what people literally fought and died for, was so that I could, that
Hmm.
I, on my own schedule, take care of my body and being by recognizing that it's tired and it needs to lie down.
Hmm.
Or even to just do it for the pure joy of doing it, the pleasure of just lying down in the sun.
Hmm.
Um, so I also say that in a way to kind of like start to wrap the conversation as well, is that, of course, doing something like running a museum,
Hmm.
like that's a big thing.
Yeah.
Trying to gather people to come to said museum and, do grief and ritual processing. That's a big thing.
Yeah.
But there's all these much smaller things that when you add them up, actually make the big things. Like, because again, it's the question of culture and the ways we actually live and the things we actually do with our lives on a day-to-day basis.
Hmm.
Um, and if there's anything that I ever want people to leave with from my work, it's that. That is like, what you do matters.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter the scale. It matters that you did it. Um, and so with that, I think my closing question to you is going to be, as relates to the work that you do and as relates to the storytelling, is there like one thing you wish people knew or that people would start practicing that you feel like,
Mm.
and again, at it like a kind of personal scale, not the big like we're going to overthrow the government scale, but the just like in your day-to-day life, what's something people can be doing that contributes from where they're at?
Yeah. Well, so I think that like uh justice work is like a constellation, right? There's a lot of different work that goes into it. And I see what we do is education, which is part of justice work. It's not everything, right? Because you have to be educated. Um, I really, the thing that I really want people to do and what I hope they get from this place is to keep being thoughtful and curious, to not take things at face value, to think a little bit harder about, what all of this means. Whether we like it or not, our full histories are inside of us, you know, and I take a lot of, we defined core values a few years ago, and one of them is honor, but it's specifically about honoring ancestors. That's in our core values as an institution. Even if they're not my ancestors or your ancestors specifically, there are ancestors here, and um, and I think of that in terms of my history practice too. That all of this history that we're talking about, everything that we're talking about, has informed us today. It informs us as individuals and it informs us as a culture. And so I want people to be curious about learning that history so that they can better understand themselves and better understand the people around them.
Beautiful. Well, that really resonates. That's like one of the things I've learned about sort of the human structural design and like the ways that we process things is that curiosity and aggression runs on the same neural networks.
Mm.
And so if the aggression and the violence that's so baked in to the cultural structures and practices and institutions that we live with, if we actually practice curiosity instead,
Mm.
we fundamentally interrupt that capacity in ourselves and even to begin to build structure around that because we're just not using our brains that way. So yeah, I love that invitation to curiosity. Um, yeah, thank you so much for this conversation. As always with these conversations, I'm like, we could talk about this for a month, a week, a year, and we
I
would
know.
still just be scratching the surface. But for folks who are interested in learning more about the Whitney, you can go visit their website, and I highly encourage you to actually go visit the site itself. For people who are interested in learning more about the ritual gathering that we'll be doing, the best way is to follow us on Instagram at the Rootwater Project, or send us an email, connect@therootwaterproject.org. Um, yeah, and I look forward to just being in conversation in all the different ways. So thanks again, Ashley. Um,
Lovely to talk to you again, as always.
yeah. All right. Well, I'm gonna close down the recording. So I'll just
Okay.
wave goodbye to everybody.
Bye.